From the shoreline, the battleships looked almost calm, gray silhouettes on a flat horizon, their decks neat, their turrets still. The Japanese soldiers watching from the cliffs had seen warships before and had lived through bombardments. They thought they knew what was coming. A noisy prelude, a terrifying but survivable storm, followed by another American landing. They had dug deep, bored caves into volcanic rock, strung telephone wires through tunnels, and told one another that stone and discipline would keep them alive. Then the first salvo landed, and the island itself seemed to recoil. Trees jumped, caves belched dust. Men were thrown from standing to prone without understanding how. These shells were not the scattered blows of field guns. They were hammer strikes from miles away, each one capable of collapsing a bunker or lifting a trench out of existence. As hours turned into a continuous roar, even veteran defenders began to realize a brutal truth. You cannot outdig an ocean of steel, and courage means little when the ground under you is trying to tear itself apart. Dawn broke over the unnamed island as a smear of pale light filtered through mist and cordite haze from the previous day's skirmishes. In a cave halfway up the southern ridge, Lieutenant Daichi Sato stood at the mouth of his command post and studied the horizon through a pair of worn binoculars. The sea beyond the reefs had been empty for weeks, broken only by distant flashes from air battles and the silhouettes of occasional destroyers darting in to fire a few probing salvos. Today was different. Even in the half-light, Sato could see the bulk of something larger, several somethings moving into position. Dark shapes, low and long, with turrets like squat towers, rotating slowly as if sniffing the wind. Behind him, the cave hummed with low voices and the ticking of a field telephone set. Runners came and went, ducking their heads under rough-hewn beams, boots crunching on gravel laid over damp rock. The garrison had spent months preparing this place. Engineers had carved firing chambers into the ridge, dug reverse-slope trenches, and created a honeycomb of shelters designed to shrug off conventional bombardment. They had studied reports from earlier battles, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Okinawa, and drawn one conclusion: survival depended on stone, depth, and discipline. So they dug deeper, reassured by diagrams that showed blast radii neatly contained by curves of rock. Out at sea, the U.S. task group finished its slow turn into the wind. On the flagship, a battleship that had already seen action from North Africa to the Central Pacific, the gunnery officer walked along the plotting boards with a grease pencil, confirming ranges and deflection corrections. Spotter planes circled high over the island, radioing back target grids and terrain sketches. The initial fire plan was brutal in its simplicity. Start at one end of the island, walk the salvos inland, then back again, until no part of the ridge remained untouched. Naval gunfire doctrine had evolved over years of amphibious warfare. This mission was the distilled product of painful lessons learned on beaches where Marines had been cut down by defenders who survived earlier, lighter bombardments. Sato received the first warning over the field phone, the line crackling as regimental headquarters relayed a message. Multiple heavy ships, possible main attack today. All units to deep shelter. Maintain readiness to repel landing. The words were familiar, an echo of dozens of earlier alerts that had passed without disaster, yet something in the voice on the other end, a clipped urgency, a slightly higher pitch, made the hair rise on the back of his neck. He lowered the receiver, glanced once more at the horizon, and saw the battleships turning broadside to the shore. Their main batteries now aimed squarely at the island. The scale of those turrets, each housing guns longer than a city street, forced a new calculation into his mind. If those weapons were built to punch through armored hulls, what would they do to a hillside? He ordered his men into the deepest recesses of the caves, voices echoing down the tunnels as squads grabbed rifles and helmets and disappeared into the rock. For years, Japanese doctrine had preached that a determined garrison, properly dug in,
could withstand anything short of direct occupation. Stone was supposed to be the final refuge. As Sato stepped back from the cave mouth, the last sliver of sea vanished behind a curtain of camouflage netting. Outside, the battleship's guns elevated in unison. Inside, an entire garrison held its breath, trusting that the earth around them would be enough.
The first salvo came not as a sound, but as a sensation. Deep in the cave network, Sato felt his chest tighten a heartbeat before the noise reached him, as if the air itself had been squeezed. Then the roar arrived, low, rolling, and so vast that it was impossible to tell where it began. Dust fell from the ceiling in thin veils. Lantern flames flickered, then steadied. For a moment, some of the younger soldiers looked at one another and allowed themselves a half-smile. If that was all, they could endure it. They had endured worse. Seconds later, the shells landed. The island bucked like a living thing. A shockwave slammed through the rock, turning every surface into a blunt weapon. Men were thrown against walls. Lanterns swung wildly, shattering glass and plunging side chambers into darkness. The sound defied description. Not one explosion, but many, overlapping and reverberating through the tunnels until it felt as though the entire world had been dropped into a drum. Dirt cascaded from ceilings, filling mouths and eyes. Someone vomited from the sudden lurch of the ground. Out at sea, the gunnery teams went to work with practiced efficiency. Plotters updated range tables as the battleship's fire control radar tracked minute shifts in position. Spotter planes circled tighter over the island, reporting bursts that landed slightly short or long. Corrections passed from sky to ship to gun in seconds. Shells, each weighing hundreds or even thousands of pounds, depending on the gun, left the barrels in brilliant flashes, their trajectories arcing invisibly toward coordinates that had been reduced to numbers on a plotting board. For the men at the breaches, the process was mechanical. Load, ram, close, fire. Yet they knew intellectually what those numbers represented. Caves, trenches, men. The bombardment settled into a terrifying rhythm. Every minute, more heavy shells slammed into the island, some hitting exposed slopes, others burrowing into the ground before detonating in muffled booms that sent strange, rolling tremors through the rock. In the deeper shelters, soldiers clung to whatever they could grab: rifle slings, rock outcroppings, each other's sleeves. The training manuals had diagrams for shell impacts, showing neat cones of fragmentation and predictable zones of collapse. What they had not shown was what happened when dozens of such impacts overlapped, when shock waves met and amplified in the confined spaces of a small island. Communication began to fray. Telephone lines strung carefully along tunnel walls snapped as rock shifted and beams splintered. Messages that did get through were short and unnerving. South Cave collapsed. Gun position 2 silent. Casualties unknown. Sato shouted into the receiver, asking for confirmation of a reported landing, but the only response he got was static and the faint rumble of distant explosions bleeding into the line. For the first time since arriving on the island, he felt truly blind. The bombardment had not only attacked his positions, it had severed the nervous system of his defense. Psychologically, the effect was corrosive. Men who had spent months convincing themselves that stone was safety now felt that same stone shudder under each blast. The more the island shook, the less their training seemed to matter. One private, barely 20, pressed his helmet so hard against his head that the straps cut into his chin, as if he could hold his skull together by force of will. Another sat with his back against the wall, lips moving silently through a prayer that broke apart every time a new salvo hit. The worst part, for many, was the uncertainty. They could not see the damage. They could only imagine what was happening to the positions closer to the surface.
After an hour, time lost its shape. The bombardment rose and fell in intensity, but never truly stopped. Sometimes the shells walked inland, and the immediate shaking eased, replaced by a distant thunder that sounded like giants rolling boulders. Then, without warning, the full weight of the barrage would return, slamming into the ridges with renewed fury. Sato tried to maintain some sense of order, moving through the tunnels, checking on platoon leaders, forcing his voice to stay level even as his own ears rang. In chamber after chamber, he found the same scene: men crouched low, gripping rifles they could not use, faces coated in dust, eyes wide and unfocused. In one gun cave near the forward slope, Sergeant Haru Nakajima tried to keep his coastal defense piece operational. The gun itself, an old naval weapon dragged inland and mounted in a concrete embrasure, had survived the first salvos. Its crew had not been so lucky. One gunner lay twisted under a fallen beam. Another sat upright against the wall, head slumped forward in a posture that suggested sleep until a closer look revealed the dark stain spreading down his chest. Nakajima barked orders to his remaining men, trying to drag the gun back into action in case the ships moved closer, but each attempt to reach the embrasure slit was beaten back by near misses that sent shards of rock knifing into the position. Out at sea, the battleships shifted targets on schedule. Fire control officers adjusted patterns to include suspected gun positions, cave mouths identified from aerial photographs, and the approaches to likely landing beaches. Washington-level debates over the effectiveness of naval bombardment would continue for years, with some arguing that determined defenders could survive almost anything underground. On this island, however, the theoretical argument mattered less than the lived reality. Even when positions were not physically destroyed, the men inside them were being ground down by continuous shock, noise, and the helplessness of waiting for blows they could not parry. At regimental headquarters, what remained of the staff huddled around a map that shed clouds of dust every time a shell landed nearby. Reports came in sporadically. A company on the western flank reported many caves collapsed, casualties severe. A mortar platoon signaled that their ammo dump had taken a direct hit and detonated, taking most of the unit with it. Other sectors were simply silent. The colonel in command, a veteran of earlier island campaigns, understood the implications. Defensive doctrine depended on overlapping fire, on mutually supporting positions that could cover one another when attacked. If too many nodes in that network were cut, the remaining ones would become isolated pockets, brave but ultimately doomed. Inside the caves, the psychological line between "we are enduring" and "we are trapped" began to blur. When dust clouds became so thick that men could not see the walls a few feet from their faces, panic nipped at the edges of discipline. Some soldiers clawed at the floor, trying to dig deeper, even as the rock underneath refused to yield. Others pressed themselves into corners, seeking some imaginary angle that would make them less exposed to the next shockwave. Sato moved among them, tapping shoulders, ordering breathing exercises, anything to impose routine on chaos. He knew that if fear took hold now, before the Americans even set foot on the island, the battle might be lost without a single bayonet charge.
By mid-afternoon, the bombardment finally slackened, though it did not stop. Salvos came less frequently, spaced out enough that the gaps between them felt like stolen breaths. In those moments, the sounds inside the caves changed. Coughing, groans, the scrape of boots on rock. Sato ordered reconnaissance teams toward the entrances, needing to know what remained of his defenses. The first men to step outside did so hesitantly, as if afraid the sky itself might fall if they looked at it directly. The world beyond the cave mouths was almost unrecognizable. Where there had been dense vegetation that morning, there were now fields of shattered stumps and bare earth. The delicate lattice of roots that had once held the topsoil together hung in the air like exposed nerves. Trenches had collapsed into irregular ditches. Some cave entrances had simply vanished, replaced by fresh scars of raw rock and disturbed soil. Bodies lay half buried, uniforms indistinguishable under layers of dust and debris.
In some places, the bombardment had been so intense that the ground appeared melted, as if the island had momentarily turned liquid under the hammer blows of the shells. From his observation slit, Sato saw something else: gaps in his own defensive grid. Machine gun nests that had anchored interlocking fields of fire were gone, their firing ports choked with rubble. Mortar positions he had relied on to break up beach assaults were silent, their crews either dead or entombed. The carefully drawn diagrams that showed overlapping arcs of fire now belonged to a different island. In their place was a patchwork of isolated pockets, each one brave, each one vulnerable. Offshore, the battleships were already adjusting for the next phase. Secondary batteries, smaller, faster-firing guns, took over much of the work, ready to plaster any visible movement on the slopes once the Marines went ashore. For the sailors on deck, the island looked softened, its once green ridges now gray and brown, pocked with impact marks. From that distance, it was easy to believe that everything living up there had been erased. Some crewmen said as much, leaning on railings and squinting through binoculars. The officers who had seen too many landings knew better. Caves were stubborn. So were the men who dug them. Back in the caves, the psychological damage continued to accumulate. Even as some soldiers returned to their positions, checking weapons and clearing firing slits, others dragged their feet, eyes still glued to the trembling ceiling. One squad leader refused to leave the deepest section of the tunnel, insisting that it was only safe here and that anyone who stepped closer to the entrance was already dead. His men hovered, torn between obedience and the very human desire to stay where the rock felt thickest. The irony was cruel. The more they sought absolute safety underground, the less able they would be to resist when the inevitable landing force arrived. Higher command recognized the shift. Intercepted post-war accounts and psychological analyses would later note that, on several Pacific islands, extended naval bombardments did not always kill large numbers of defenders outright, but they often shattered coordination and morale to the point where organized resistance became far harder to sustain. On this island, the colonel facing his battered map realized he was on the edge of that precipice. He could continue to order rigid defense of every position, trusting in pre-war ideals of honor and sacrifice, or he could begin quietly planning for a fighting withdrawal that might preserve some fraction of his men. The bombardment had turned what was supposed to be a static fortress into a crumbling maze.
When the American landing craft finally appeared, riding low in the water as they approached the battered shoreline, the defenders who remained at their guns were operating on a mix of training, habit, and raw nerves. Some positions opened fire as soon as targets came into view, tracers streaking from half-collapsed embrasures. Others hesitated, their crews struggling to reorient themselves in a landscape whose landmarks had been erased. Sato moved between forward command posts, shouting into ears dulled by hours of thunder, trying to knit together a coherent defense from the fragments that remained. Naval gunfire shifted again, this time to a tighter, more surgical pattern. Destroyers and cruisers moved closer inshore, using direct observation and spotter plane calls to pick off any muzzle flashes they saw on the ridges. The heavy battleship guns, having spent the day reshaping the island, now fired less frequently, their salvos reserved for stubborn strongpoints or suspected reserves. For the Japanese soldiers still in those positions, each flash from the sea felt personal, a message written in fire. You are seen. You are targeted. Your refuge is conditional. As the battle ground on, patterns emerged that would later interest historians and psychiatrists alike. Some units fought with the fanatical tenacity expected from earlier Pacific campaigns, staying in their caves until flames or explosives physically forced them out. Others, however, began to fracture sooner than doctrine predicted. Small groups slipped away from forward positions without orders, seeking deeper, darker shelters where they could no longer see the sky.
A few soldiers, confronted with the prospect of enduring another day of earth-shaking bombardment, chose surrender over what they now saw as purposeless death, waving improvised white flags when they realized the Americans were willing to take prisoners. For the men on the battleships, the psychological toll took a different form. They experienced the battle as data and flashes, as distant impacts and reports. Target neutralized, gun positions silenced, ridge saturated. Yet some sailors would later describe dreams in which the island's ridges were not made of rock, but of faces, and every shell that landed erased one. Knowing that each broadside could collapse an entire hillside was a source of tactical pride and private unease. War psychiatry reports after the conflict noted that prolonged bombardment missions, especially when observers knew they were firing on entrenched human targets, contributed to their own variety of stress reactions among naval personnel. By the time the island was declared secure, its name had already begun to fade into the long list of Pacific engagements. Strategically, it would be remembered as another stepping stone, another launch point, pushing the front line closer to Japan. For those who survived on both sides, it symbolized something more specific. The moment when sheer mechanical power stripped away the illusion that courage and concrete could always stand up to steel. Sato, taken prisoner after being wounded in a collapsed tunnel, would later tell an interrogator that it was not the shells themselves that broke his men, but the feeling that the ground had turned hostile. "We were taught," he said, "that the earth would protect us if we dug deep enough." Then the earth started to shake. In that sentence lay the quiet verdict on naval bombardment's true legacy in the Pacific. Not just craters and shattered bunkers, but the realization that there was, at last, no truly safe place on the battlefield. Only degrees of exposure to forces vast enough to make even the bravest soldier feel very small.